Hello, everyone. It's Michael Shermer, and you know what it's time for? Another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. This one brought to you by Wondrium, W-O-N-D-R-I-U-M, the new name for the former teaching company and their great courses, which I've been listening to for decades. If you go to wondrium.com/Shermer, S-H-E-R-M-E-R, Wondrium, W-O-N-D-R-I-U-M.com/Shermer, you can get 2 years subscription for the price of 1 year. It's a great deal. You get all this access to all these hundreds and hundreds of college courses, plus other lessons and tutorials, documentary films, documentary shorts, series, and so forth. It's just fabulous. Here's an example. I'm going to give you this one, talk about this one that has come up in my feed. I've heard some of these lectures already. Why Evil Exists. Seriously, there's a whole course on this? Yeah, incredibly interesting. 36 30-minute lectures. An award-winning professor offers a richly provocative and revealing encounter into Western civilization's greatest thinking and insight on the critical subject of evil. Well, I wrote a book about this called The Science of Good and Evil. So I cover a lot of this. The course goes through all the religious, ancient Greece, and then Hebrew, and then Christian scriptures, and Augustine, rabbinical Judaism and its thoughts on evil, on self-deception and evil, scholasticism, Dante, Reformation, Hobbes. Of course, you got to have Hobbes in there. Montaigne, Pascal, Milton, the Enlightenment, Kant, Hegel, Marx. All the greats are in here. And they all have commented on evil because it's such an obvious problem in human nature. Dostoevsky, Conrad, Camus, post-World War II Protestant theology on evil, obvious reasons, the Holocaust, the Nazis, Hannah Arendt on the banality of evil, of course, at the Eichmann trial. This guy doesn't look evil. He looks like just a paper-pushing bureaucrat, essentially what he was. How is that possible? Anyway, it's just a fascinating subject. You can listen to these while you're doing anything, really. I always have those earbuds in, and I'm just grinding through courses and audio content like this, and so should you. 2 years for the price of one. Go to wondrium.com/Shermer, WONDRIUM.com/SHERMER. Check it out. 2 years for the price of one. It's an incredible deal. Go for it. And that shows your support for the show too, which I deeply appreciate. All right. Thanks for listening. Let me properly introduce our guest. He is David E. Bernstein, who holds a university professorship chair at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, where he's been teaching since 1995. He's also been a visiting professor at the University of Michigan, Georgetown University, William & Mary, Brooklyn Law School, and the University of Turin. Known as a fearless contrarian, we like contrarians on this show, Professor Bernstein often challenges the conventional wisdom with prodigious research and sharp original analysis. His book, Rehabilitating Lochner, was praised across the political spectrum as intellectual history in its highest form, a fresh perspective and a cogent analysis, delightful and informative, sharp and iconoclastic, well-written and destined to be influential, and a terrific work of historical revisionism. Professor Bernstein blogs at the Volokha, how do you pronounce that? Volokha Conspiracy. Of course, I love that title. The leading law professor blog, and at instapundit.com. Professor Bernstein is a graduate of the Yale Law School, where he was senior editor of the Yale Law Journal and the John M. Olin Fellow in Law, Economics, and Public Policy. Professor Bernstein is married, has 3 children of mixed Eastern European, Middle Eastern European, and Spanish Jewish origins. And you'll see why he puts that in his bio now, because his new book is called Classified: The Untold Story of Racial Classification in America. It is blissfully and not too long a book. I listened to the whole thing on audio. And I have to tell you, David, it was difficult to keep track of all the labels that the government bureaucrats have come up with for all these different, I don't know if they're just racial groups or racial populations or whatever you want to call them. It's just mind-boggling how complex it is. So let's just start there. I mean, we're recording this the first week of November, and the Supreme Court just started to hear the arguments in I forget the name of the case, but it's the accusation that Harvard and another university, North Carolina, I think it is, discriminated against Asian students by requiring them to have higher SATs and GPAs to get in compared to other groups?
Yeah, so just the way we start off that discussion, what does this mean, Asian, right? I mean, the idea that you take literally the entire population of the world from the western border of Pakistan all the way to the Philippines. And by the way, we have a separate classification for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. And even though Filipinos are literally Pacific Islanders, right? Because the Philippines are Pacific Islands, they're not in that category, they're in the Asian category. They're also ethnographically more related to Micronesians than to other Asians. But in any event, we take all those people, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, Malaysians, Mongolians, Koreans, Vietnamese, Cambodians, go on and on. And within those countries, there's often multiple ethnic groups as well. I mean, India is not just one ethnic group, for example. And we put them all together and we call them Asians. And then Harvard will say, well, we want more diversity and we have too many Asians. What they really have is a lot of people who have parents or grandparents who immigrated here from India, China, Japan, maybe Korea. They don't have a lot of Malaysians or Filipinos or Vietnamese, but we classify them all in this crude quasi-racial classification that we call Asians, and then pretend that they all are basically the same.
Yeah, that's just astonishing. It's just hard to imagine a biologist making sense of any of that, right? I mean, these are populations very different, just on eyesight, but also genetics. You know, Pakistanians, Indians, all the way down into Australia, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, you know, and so on. Everything you just mentioned. How can anybody think that's one group?
And the craziest thing is, I normally don't get to talk about this, but I know a lot of your audience will be interested in science. Maybe the most shocking thing to me in the whole book is and I wasn't really even aware of this until someone pointed it out to me very late in my research. The U.S. government decided back in the late 1990s to order the Food and Drug Administration and the National Institutes of Health via congressional legislation to start requiring that subjects in biomedical research that are either regulated by or funded by one of these agencies to collect racial data on all of their subjects in their research and then break down the results by so-called race. But, I mean, one could argue, I argue in the book, that using race in general is really quite a poor substitute for using genetics, which we can do today because we have cheap DNA tests. But to the extent that one would use race, one would never use race the way we use it and consider, for example, Hispanics to be the equivalent of a racial group. Hispanics can have ancestry in Africa, they can have ancestry in Europe, they can have ancestry in Latin America from indigenous people or even Asia, and it makes no scientific sense to lump them all together in scientific research. So now I do, besides my work on this sort of issue and constitutional stuff, I do write about expert and scientific testimony. When I come across a study now where it says, well, we studied Asians, I ask, well, which Asians did you study? Because what relevance would a study on people from India have on people from China and vice versa when there's no real genetic connection there beyond what any two random humans might have?
Right. So the organization representing the students in this lawsuit are claiming that Asians, however you define it, however Harvard, I guess, defines it, because that's the only thing that matters, right, is that they had to get higher GPAs and higher SATs. I forget what the numbers are. Like in the SAT, they had to have like 200 points higher than other racial groups to be comparable and being accepted.
Well, the hierarchy in admissions in elite universities is basically that African Americans get the biggest preference. Hispanics get some preference, but not as much as African Americans. Whites get they're the sort of the standard that by which other groups are judged, considered the largest, and Asian Americans face some level of discrimination. And the way it seems that Harvard discriminated because Harvard knew it was going to be a target potentially of lawsuits. They were pretty careful about how they went about this. But ultimately what they did is there's one really subjective component of the Harvard process of deciding who to admit, and that was to have an interview with members of the Harvard admissions staff, and they give you like a personality rating, how charming basically you are. And somehow it turns out that Black students were the most charming and outgoing and had the best leadership qualities, and Asians universally had the lowest. So it was especially interesting and really damning about that data is when they asked alumni interviewers to interview Asian American applicants, they got the same basic scores as whites on this subjective criteria. But when the alumni, the people working at Harvard who knew what they were trying to accomplish, which is get fewer Asians, somehow the Asians became less personable when speaking to the Harvard admissions office. So I think it's fairly clear that Harvard was trying to keep down its number of Asians. And, it has something to do with the fact that when we talk about diversity in higher education, while Harvard will argue that this isn't true, basically what it comes down to is they want visual kind of diversity where you look around, you see people of different colors and different sort of skin tones and different, eye shape and all that. And they're not really looking for people who have they're looking separately for people who have diverse interests and backgrounds. They have to fill up the orchestra and the football team. But when it comes to looking at people based on their ethnic heritage, they don't really care if you're a Crimean Tatar or a Laplander or a Bosnian refugee or a whirling dervish from Turkey or some other really interesting background. What they're really looking at, we want brown people, Black people, Asian people, and whites. Not too many of any of them, but not too few either.
Right. So yesterday, Clarence Thomas, after the opening rounds, issued a quote that was all over the news that, I keep hearing this word diversity and I really don't know what it means. Well, I mean, he knows what it means. He knows what they think it means, right? Which is what you just said. If you look around the campus, you see a lot of different skin tones. That's what diversity has come to mean.
Yeah, it's really remarkable because, as some of your listeners may know, the idea that affirmative action, that the reason we have it is for quote-unquote diversity purposes, was not the original rationale. The original rationale was really, look, it's a few years after the Civil Rights Movement, African Americans have been excluded for generations from mainstream society. We want to give them some boost so that we create sort of a leadership class and an upper and middle class for African Americans so they could join the American mainstream. But the Supreme Court in 1978 said you couldn't do that, but Justice Powell wrote an opinion saying what you could do is you could use race to try to get a diverse class the way you might use, being a football player or an oboe player, or make sure you have a kid from Montana as well as New York or whatnot. So the universities ran with it because it's what they had to run with. But ironically, maybe actually there are people who came to believe in this whole diversity thing. It's not still, I think, the primary reason why people support it, but the phrase diversity has come so intimately to mean this very specific kind of diversity, not even ethnic diversity specifically, but very specifically, we want to have enough, whatever that means, Hispanics, Blacks, Asians, and whites. And I've spoken to students who people ask me, is your law school, does it have a diverse student body? This was years ago, someone asked me this, and I said, well, we don't have that many quote-unquote underrepresented minority students, but we have students from all over the United States. We have a lot of older law students who have previous experience in various jobs. We have a lot of religious different groups. We have Mormons and Jews and Catholics and evangelicals and atheists and so forth and so on. I went through all the different, and he's like, no, do you have diversity?
Right.
And he didn't even really know that there was another meaning to the word diversity, which I thought was really kind of crazy.
Right. Since you're a law professor, let me ask you this. Why can't Harvard do whatever it wants? It's a private institution, not a government agency. I guess they receive government money in the form of fellowships and grants and so forth. But if they want to have whatever percentage of students they want of this group or that group, why can't they?
Well, philosophically, we could discuss whether they should have that right. But as a practical legal matter, they're bound by the 1964 Civil Rights Act, by Title VI specifically of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which says that any university that accepts federal funds, and almost all universities do, because accepting federal funds includes just having your students get federally guaranteed student loans. Any university accepts federal funds may not discriminate based on race. The language seems pretty clear and unequivocal. The only equivocation comes from the fact that the Supreme Court has held that the scope of the 1964 Civil Rights Act with regard to discrimination is the same as the scope of the 14th Amendment, which bans states from discriminating. And to the extent that states may have more leeway to engage in affirmative action than to engage in other forms of discrimination, which may be considered more invidious, that might give Harvard some opportunity as well. And that's been the theory that we've been operating under since 1978.
Is that 78? Is that the Baki case?
Baki, yes.
And if I recall, he was a pre-med student who applied to medical school and scored high on an MCATs, but didn't get into UC Berkeley, was it? Even though students of different races with lower MCATs did get in.
Yeah, it was UC Davis, I think, had a new medical school, and they had 100 spots in each class, and they reserved, if I'm remembering correctly, 18 of them for minority students. And one of the really interesting things about Baki that people don't recognize is that while at the time, I'm just old enough to remember seeing, reading the New York Times as a kid, which I used to get in school for 5 cents, and reading about it and hearing my parents discussing it, it was seen as almost entirely a black-white conflict, that it's reverse discrimination in favor of blacks against whites. But even then, when we had a much less truly diverse country, of the 18 students who got into this program every year, only about 1/3 of them were black. And another, I'm going to get my fractions confused if I'm not careful, but most of the students who got the preference were Mexican. There was no Hispanic classification yet. So they just said Mexican American. And then quite a few were Asian. And somehow, despite the fact that 2/3 of the students who got the preferences were not black, the whole public discussion was about what we owe or don't owe to African Americans and what we should do about it. And this is something that continues today. Every time I read an op-ed or column or blog post about the case, especially coming from the people who support affirmative action, it's always, well, what about centuries of Jim Crow? It's like, well, Hispanic, 25% of 18-year-olds are Hispanic, only 15% are black. Hispanics are also getting a preference. Most people who are getting a preference are Hispanic, and none of them were subject to Jim Crow in the United States. So that can't be the rationale for these programs overall. But anyway, in Baki, 4 justices said that you can't discriminate based on race, even in favor of minorities, under the 1964 Civil Rights Act. 4 justices would have allowed discrimination in favor of minorities up to and including quotas, like they had at Davis. And Justice Powell, the 5th vote, said you can't have quotas, but again, you can give a preference for diversity. And that's been reaffirmed several times in slightly different permutations since then. But I think what is clear to me, at least, is in each case, the Supreme Court says, okay, we're going to let you use race, but we really disfavor it. It's dangerous. It's offensive. We're only letting it used for these really narrow purposes. Only do it for that reason. And the Supreme Court says, and then the reaction of all the universities has been and continues to be, oh, the Supreme Court has basically said not what they actually said, which is you're supposed to use race really narrowly, but you can do whatever you want as long as you don't have formal quotas. And that's been the last 50 years, basically.
So now Harvard and the other universities that do this, I guess, are justifying saying race is just one of many characteristics we're looking for in a diverse student body, and it's not as big a deal as it's being made out to be.
Well, they also said that 45% of the black and Hispanic students at Harvard wouldn't be there, they acknowledged, but for the preference they give for race. That seems like a fairly significant boost if your chances are going up that significantly. And I was sort of bemused, if that's the right word, by listening to the arguments yesterday, because what Harvard was arguing, and UNC especially even more so was arguing, is that race is never dispositive, but if we didn't use race, the admission of Hispanic and black students would plummet. Now, this is obviously statistically impossible, right? It cannot possibly be the case that if it's not dispositive. And Justice Alito said that, wait a second, you're telling us it's not dispositive, it doesn't matter, then why have it? Oh, but it matters. Well, it can't be. So what they're really saying is they're using dispositive in the way that normal people speaking English don't use the word dispositive. They're saying no one gets in solely because of race. We don't just pick a random black person and stick them in the class. They have to have other attributes. Okay, but that's not what dispositive means, right? Dispositive means without that particular criterion, you would not have gotten in. And obviously it's dispositive in a lot of cases. And there's some crazy statistics along the lines of, like, if you're in the top 10% of the students at Harvard is considering based on purely academics, your chances of getting, if you're Asian, are like 15%, and if you're African American, 95%. I mean, that's a pretty big difference.
Yeah, interesting. Dispositive, right. You looked at a picture of the Harvard student body in 1950. It's pretty white, right? And there's no women. Radcliffe was the women's college, right? They didn't even integrate men and women until, I don't know what, the 70s or something like that, right? Might have been the 60s. So in a way, I'm just kind of to try to steel a man the other side. It seems like something needed to be done. I mean, we know also that they discriminated against Jews. I mean, one of the reasons there are Jewish schools and Jewish universities is because they weren't allowed to go to other universities. So it seems like the past was pretty bad and not very diverse. And there were, so the rationale would be something like what I heard in the 90s when I was teaching at Occidental College. And they wanted to increase the diversity of the student body, and they meant race, people of color, and so on. And then there were discussions, well, we're going to have to lower the SAT and GPA requirements and so on. And the response to that was, yeah, that's okay. It's going to take a couple generations until we get to where we want to be, where it's truly equal or something like that. And, they invoke something like President Johnson's famous line about, you can't take a man to the starting line of a race who's been hobbled his whole life and say, you're free to compete equally now. We do have to compensate for what's happened in the past. So can we at least say it was a good idea at the start and maybe it's time for a change now? Or how do you think about it that way?
Well, look, there's a few complications here, right? One complication is that in Baki, when Justice Powell said, oh, Harvard, Justice Powell is sort of going completely off on his own because none of the briefs really argued what he stated, except for Harvard University filed a friend of the court brief saying, well, you should allow at least what we do. We have this holistic review where we look at all sorts of things, including race. But one of the ironies is that the holistic review that Harvard undertook was to keep down the percentage of Jews, because Harvard at some point in its history had said, well, we don't want to be discriminating, so let's have an entrance exam. And it turned out too many Jews were passing the entrance exam. So they said, oh, well, we should only make the entrance exam now one factor in admissions, and we should look to things like personality and leadership and all the things that Harvard is now using against Asians. So I think that the plaintiffs properly point out that the more subjective you get, the more it allows the university to just decide to discriminate in whatever way it wants. I should say, even when I was applying to colleges in the mid 80s, even then it was well known that still the reason that the Ivies all wanted quote unquote geographic diversity was they didn't want Jews from New York filling up 50% of their class. So it was Jews were enough percentage that no one was gonna file a lawsuit about it. But I was told explicitly by my friend, my father's friend, who was the alumni admissions officer for one of the Ivy League schools. I was told, how come David didn't get in? He thought he was great. Well, we have too many Jewish kids from New York this year. So this was still going on even in the 80s. And now it's more with Asians. So that's one complication. The other complication, as I mentioned, is that we are giving more Hispanics now get preferences than African Americans. They don't share this history. Most Hispanics in the United States are people who immigrated after 1965 when we had civil rights laws and affirmative action. So they're in a better position in some sense than earlier immigrant groups that didn't have benefit of such policies. And a lot of Hispanics, it's very complicated why the Hispanic preferences in universities are often called racial preferences. But Hispanics are officially an ethnicity, not a race. And if you fill out the common application for college, it first asks, are you Hispanic or not, and then what race you are. And slightly over 50% of Hispanics in the U.S. consider themselves white, and many of them don't look any different than if not the average Caucasian American, then at least a Mediterranean person from Spain or Italy, much less Armenians, other people who have relatively dark skin. It's not really clear why the fact you happen to have Spanish-speaking ancestry provides any particular benefit in admissions, other than it just sort of worked out that way and we've gotten used to it. And the third complication is that a very large percentage, a wildly disproportionate percentage of the students in Ivy League colleges who get preferences for being Black Americans are first or second generation immigrants from the Caribbean and Africa. It's over 40% at Harvard, and at some schools it's over 50%. If you add them together with students who are biracial, who have one white parent, it's even higher. And there actually is occasionally rumblings of unrest at some of these colleges among the students who are what they now call ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves, who say, wait a second, supposedly these diversity policies were meant to bring, the people who are excluded historically from the United States into the mainstream, even if we don't call it that, we call it diversity. And yet I get to this campus and everyone has, African or Jamaican accents and so forth. And you're not even doing that. And, some groups like Nigerian Americans actually have higher education levels and higher incomes on average than white Americans. The question is, well, why are they getting benefits? They neither are underprivileged economically or socioeconomically relative to whites, nor did their ancestors suffer slavery and Jim Crow and segregation thereafter. So one could make the argument that we should have limited sorts of preferences specifically for descendants of American slaves, especially those who are stuck in high concentration of poverty areas, maybe add American Indians with close cultural and physical ties to their tribes, like people who live on reservations. But that's not actually what we're doing right now.
Yeah, if I can just ask you, since you were raised in a Jewish home, you hear, why are Asians doing so well? And therefore they have to be discriminated against, or we'll have nothing but Asians on our campus. And the answer you get is, well, culture of learning and books, and the parents, the tiger moms cracking down on them, making them do their homework every night, and so on and so forth. And of course, before them, Jewish communities had their own schools, and they had a rich culture of learning and books and reading to their children at night and so on. You hear all these studies about that. Do you think that's the explanation? And if so, how can a university or a government make that happen in communities where that isn't the case, where they don't have that kind of home life?
Look, there are obviously some people on the left who will say everything is institutional discrimination, and there's some people on the right who will go immediately to genetic explanations. And I want to point out, for whatever it's worth, that culture, I don't know to what, I'm not a sociologist or anthropologist or geneticist or anything else, right? I'm just a humble law professor. But I can say from my background knowledge that culture can clearly be a very important factor in the relative success of groups. And the example I like to give there from my own experiences are Orthodox Jews in New York City, right? So you have two basic groups of Orthodox Jews. You have modern Orthodox Jews, the ones who wear the knitted kippahs and basically dress in sort of standard American clothing and go to baseball games and go to the movies and send their kids to Jewish schools, but they have a high emphasis on secular learning as well. Then you have the more sometimes called ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Jews, the ones who wear the black suits and the black hats, are much more insular, tend not to go to higher education, tend not to be, to them, the highest value is really, are you fulfilling the commandments and being a charitable person, and your success of being a partner at a law firm or doctor, right? That's not nearly as important. And these are two groups. They live in the same geographic area. You probably couldn't get any genetic differences among them that are significant. And modern Orthodox Jews have much higher family income, education levels, wealth. I mean, all the things that we consider when we look at group differences are that they have fewer children, which is also helpful in having lower poverty rates. Now, the ultra-Orthodox don't do too badly, considering that they tend to go to very underfunded schools where Yiddish is the first language. They don't learn much English or math. On the other hand, the schools are very rigorous, and academic training in a sense is academic training, because who really uses most of what they learn in school anyway? But in any event, there are significant socioeconomic and educational differences, but the same groups of people really. Just one has decided that one has veered towards a culture where secular kinds of success are deemed extremely important, along with religion. They even have the same underlying religion, of course. Basically, the other group has veered the other way, and there you can see substantial differences. So I think we do rule out culture at our peril, and we also should point out that, again, when we talk about Asians, it's not all Asian groups that are so successful. It's really Indians, Chinese, Japanese, and to some extent Koreans. Filipinos, Vietnamese are maybe slightly above average as far as education and income and so forth. And there are some groups that are below average: Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Hmong, and others. And we can't just generalize that there's like a broad Asian culture out there. And finally, I should say, there is, who knows? Again, I'm just a humble law professor. Who knows what all the possible things that go into group differences are, with culture obviously being a very significant one. But, there's no country that's multi-ethnic and multiracial and so forth where every group is exactly equal. There's always one group that tends to veer more towards education and the professions, and another that tends to be more small shopkeepers, and others that tend to maybe not be farmers and so forth. And Thomas Sowell, who is one of the great heroes of this stuff, has written a tremendous amount about it. I mean, in the United States, we obviously have this legacy of Jim Crow that's important. But if you just take, the white group, right? I mean, we call it, one thing we have to keep in mind, we're talking about how ridiculous in some ways all these racial classifications are. White includes everyone officially, from Icelanders to Norwegians to French to Turks to Arabs to Berbers to Persians to Greeks, right? And you can see significant differences in all sorts of. We don't study it nearly as much as the others because the government doesn't collect statistics. If you're trying to get a PhD, it's a lot easier to just look at the government statistics for Hispanics and blacks and just plug that into your stuff. But the people who do occasionally do research on American ethnic heritage you'll find big differences between different white groups. So the worst off group of the United States, other than Indians living on reservations, are Appalachian whites. Right? They have very low rates of education, high rates of alcoholism, drug addiction, teenage pregnancy, like all the social pathologies that some are sometimes associated with the inner city are also in Appalachia, but simply because we don't anymore, unlike when we were, when Johnson was advocating for the Great Society, it wasn't really about poor black people. It was mostly pictures of Appalachia. If you ever look at the literature from the day, we don't talk about Appalachian whites that much because they're just subsumed in the white category. But again, big difference between Appalachian whites and Silicon Valley engineers or Jews from. I mean, I don't find I have much culturally in common with someone who grew up in a rural area in the mountains of Tennessee. I mean, we're both white people. And I guess we're both therefore less likely to get stopped by the police. But where do our cultural similarities go beyond that?
Yeah, well, I read J.D. Vance's book about, growing up in Appalachia, and, it was very moving. Now he's kind of lost his mind going the whole Trump political route, but he really tells that story. Hillbilly Elegy. Yeah, it's a great book. And, right, so those people are quite different. This is the problem with using a big category like race. And biologists don't really use the term at all. It's just populations. There's just different populations, and they vary in size and location and so forth. How did Jews become a race? That doesn't even really make sense. And since we're on the topic of current events, with Kanye West, spiking the anti-Semitic ball into the end zone, Kanye was right about the Jews, and as if it's a racial group or whatever. Do you think it's worse now, or is it just a little temporary spike? I mean, anti-Semitism since the Second World War has gotten much better, but it seems like recently taking a turn.
It's a really good question. The data I've seen doesn't show any actual overall increase in anti-Semitism among the American public. And indeed, Jews are the most popular religious group among all the religious groups in the United States. There's generally warm feelings from the left, from the right, from Christians, from atheists. I don't know how long that will last from the left, as the Jewish population is getting more orthodox because they have more children and are more likely to stay Jewish. So we'll see. As already, New York Times already have been having a series of like articles that's supposed to be news articles that are basically attacking very Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn on a variety of grounds. Especially, they don't like the fact that they tend to be right wing politically, obviously. But in any event, I don't think that's the problem. The problem is on the fringes. The fringes are getting more vocal, more violent, and there's good things and bad things about the fact that we no longer have media gatekeepers anymore. But one of the bad things is that a lot of nutty stuff that was always around on the fringes of society was kept on the fringes of society. And between that and the lack of an internet, so there may have been, anti-Semites in some town, in 1980, but to meet each other, they had to sort of hand out leaflets and find some, dirty, dark conference room in the local Days Inn to meet. It's kind of difficult. Now you just go on Twitter, you meet other people. It gets amplified. A lot of crazy stuff that I think would have been kept out of the mainstream, like fringy left and right-wing conspiracies about Israel, for example, that just wouldn't have found their way to the New York Times. If the New York Times doesn't publish it, one of the left-wing websites will publish it, and then the New York Times loses readers. So now, they sort of co-opt it. They may be a little bit toned down. Maybe it's like less explicitly nutty than what you might see on a website like Mondoweiss, which is the leading probably anti-Israel website. But their writers wind up in the front page on the op-ed pages of the New York Times, where you would have kept that out. Similarly, the Kanye West stuff, I think it reflects to a large extent a combination of influence of general conspiracism from the right. A lot of his stuff clearly has its origins in the kind of anti-Semitism that Farrakhan and other people on the fringes of the black community indulge in. And again, in the old days, Farrakhan might have given a speech to an audience somewhere, but it was sort of limited to that, and you would never sort of hear about it. And if someone like Kanye West was going, in fact, people say, well, Kanye West was interviewing, and when people interviewed him, they just cut out the crazy stuff. They were censoring him. Maybe they could have nipped this in the bud. But that's what the mainstream kind of did. They didn't want to broadcast nutty racism, anti-Semitism. But now, even if the mainstream tries to do that, you have Twitter, you have Instagram, it'll still get out there. So I think that, to me, that is the big problem, that we lack gatekeepers. We're in a brave new world of the internet, where anyone could be their own publisher, where clicks are what you want rather than truth, right? You have the only two ways of getting revenue now are to either have a lot of traffic and get advertisers that way, or to have subscriptions, and both of those rely on having a fan base that just wants to hear what it wants to hear. The old days, the New York Times, Washington Post, they were biased, but they tried to keep things like mainstream because they want to represent the whole. They want everyone to subscribe because they want Macy's to be advertising their next issue. But now the New York Times' model is the people who the better example, Washington Post. What's our business model? Trump got to be president. We're going to be the democracy dies in darkness. We're going to appeal to all the anti-Trump people, subscribe. And what incentive is your business model then? Is to just appeal to that narrow segment. So that's my take. My take is not that there's been a huge new wave of anti-Semitic sentiment, but the sentiment that was always on the fringes and was sort of suppressed by the gatekeepers is not being suppressed anymore.
Yeah, I agree with that. This painting over my left shoulder here, by the way, is Louis Farrakhan and Militia, as in that classic American painting that was one of our covers.
Oh, look at that.
Done by Pat Lindsay, my late partner there, who was the art director of Skeptic. She painted that back in the day when you actually painted covers. And so Farrakhan, he reached a lot of people, but again, it was mostly in person. And the few snippets you would see was just kind of the inspirational stuff. And it's hard to find the really nutty stuff where he went off on weird numerology things and the Jews are doing this and that. But now, of course, it gets amplified, and within hours you see there was, signs in LA on the 405 freeway on the overpasses. Kanye was right about the Jews, and then it was like Sunday on some big or Saturday at a college football stadium. Kanye was right about the Jews. Astonishing. how quickly that spreads.
And, one of the weird things about this, I don't know what to do about this, but on the one hand, you don't want to ignore it. But on the other hand, when some nuts put out, spend $100 putting up a sign on the freeway, and then, a few people are going to see it, don't even pay attention, but all of a sudden it's on national news, it sort of in a way makes it more mainstream. I was very upset, actually, before Charlottesville. We all remember Charlottesville and the neo-Nazi march. I was like, why is the media descending on Charlottesville as if there's a rally of 3 million brown shirts? These guys have called for a national rally. They get like 300 or 500 people there, not all of whom were even neo-Nazis. If you just ignore it, it becomes like nothing. Instead, it became this massive. The neo-Nazis got more attention than they ever could have possibly gotten on their own. Someone got killed, and what if you had just said, look, it's 300 people out of 330 million, just ignore them?
Oh, they would hate that. Actually, that's the worst thing that could happen to an activist, is be ignored. I used to say that during when Milo Yiannopoulos was all the rage for about 6 months. And, people were just lining up to go to his speeches to protest. It's like, what he would hate worse than that is nobody shows up, right?
Right.
So that, of course, leads to having to ramp things up more so people feel outraged, so then they will respond. Okay, let's dive into your book. Let's just hit a couple of these hot button topics that listeners will recall. And then you just make a few comments about each of them. Elizabeth Warren, Pocahontas, because she claimed to have Cherokee ancestry. Tiger Woods, who said he was a Cablinasian, a mixture of white, European, African, Thai, and Chinese. George Zimmerman famously was acquitted of murdering a black man who is himself claimed to be Hispanic or half Hispanic or mixed race or white Hispanic or something. And then Rachel Dolezal, a white woman who was the head of the NCAA chapter in, I think, Seattle or the state of Washington, maybe, and that she identified as African American. Okay. And then finally, Kamala Harris, our vice president, who is, of course, promoted as being the first African American vice president, but she's a child of Indian immigrant mother, a father of mixed African and European races. So, I mean, that's a nice kind of avenue into the complexity and bureaucracy of what your book is about, of this whole classified system.
Yeah, so I think that one point we need to make here is that we typically think of race or ethnicity in the United States as being self-identified. And to a large extent, it's true. When you apply for a mortgage, you check one of the boxes as they ask you to do, and if you don't do it, they check it for you. No one's going to come and look at your genealogy or make you do a DNA test to prove it. So to a large extent, it is. But that said, these classifications that are on those forms that we all fill out all the time didn't arise spontaneously. They're not just, and there's not different boxes on different forms. They're all basically come from the federal government, from something that's kind of obscure called Statistical Directive Number 15, which was promulgated in the 1970s. And the idea was basically after the Civil Rights Revolution and the growth of the federal government's trying to keep track both of how different groups are doing and also especially to make sure that anti-discrimination laws are being complied with. And how do they do that? Well, they have to gather statistics. The problem was that there was no agreed upon terminology and definitions for different groups. So what we now call Hispanics, no one called them Hispanic in 1970. There was no such thing. If you talked about Hispanic, the way that word was used in 1970 was Hispanic literature, which meant literature from Spain. So like Cervantes was Hispanic. The people weren't Hispanic. But, the government was getting data from different agencies. Some agencies had Chicanos. Some had Mexican Americans. Some had Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans. Some had Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans. Some had any or all of those groups and other. Some had Hispanos. Some had Latinos. Some had Spanish-speaking households. Some had Spanish language households. Some had Spanish surname. So they're getting data from all over the government that doesn't match. They can't. They're getting apples and oranges. So they can't combine the data. So they sit back. Okay, let's just come up with classifications that make some sense for data collection. And for data collection, given, again, the main purpose was anti-discrimination laws, there weren't a lot of Asians in the country at that time. For Hispanics, well, not all Hispanics really face any more discrimination than other people because some are white. But for anti-discrimination purposes, if you're looking at employment, someone sees the name Martinez on a resume, they won't know what you look like. They may just not like brown people, so they'll just throw it away. Okay, that makes a certain amount of sense. So they just got this sort of very informal kind of commission together. They came up with these definitions. They gave them these classifications: Black, white, Native American, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Hispanic, which was an ethnicity, not a race. And they said these are the ones we're going to use. Here are the definitions. They don't match each other. Like Hispanic is a linguistic-based one. For African American Black, it was, are you descended from one of the black races of Africa? For Europeans, it's, are you descended from one of the original peoples of Europe or the Middle East or North Africa? Then you're white. They don't match each other, but they're good enough for these limited purposes. And most Americans are either black or white. At the time, there wasn't a lot of intermarriage between those groups. We know, and we sort of had a one-drop rule. Anyone who looks at all black is black, so we sort of know what we're talking about. Good enough. And they said, by the way, these are not anthropological, they're not sociological, they're not scientific, they shouldn't be used for eligibility for any program. Right? So, and that's how it stayed, no one would really care. But of course, that's not how government works. As soon as the government creates these classifications and people have to report based on these classifications, interest groups then say, oh, well, we're going to be the people who represent the Hispanic classification, or the, like, who in 1970, other than a few sort of radical activists who were promoting this, would have said that they were Asian American. That's not like, you know, I mean, I've been to, I was in Hawaii recently, and I visited one of the coffee plantations. There was the Filipino camp, and the Japanese camp, and the Chinese camp, and the Portuguese camp. But there was no Asian camp because they're not the same groups, right? And even today, most people who we call Asian American, even after 50 years, don't want to be called Asian American. Only like about 38% of people accept it at all. On campuses, it's much higher because they're used to it. But in the general public, like, no, I'm either just American or Chinese American, but don't call me like Asian. That doesn't make any sense. But like I said, once you have these classifications, they become embedded in society, in politics, in rent seeking, and trying to get benefits for your group and at the expense of everybody else. Universities use them for affirmative action because they're already collecting statistics anyway. This is an easy way without, they don't have to think about, well, what are we really trying to accomplish here? Minority business enterprise preferences in government contracting rely on them. But again, they were really, in 1970, if you look at the census, there was 12% Black Americans, less than 1% of the United States was Asian, 5% what we would now call Hispanic, but they were considered white at the time. And the rest of the population, very small number of people identified as American Indians, and the rest, almost 90%, were white. So we had this black-white binary, and again, the rate of intermarriage was really low, and we had sort of a one-drop rule. So no one really paid that much attention to, well, do these classifications make sense in a multi-ethnic population with lots of immigrants from all over the world, because we were not that in 1970. Fast forward 50 years later, and even in the Black community, we have a lot of interracial marriage, interracial births now. A lot of people have one parent who's Black and one who's white, including some very famous activists like Hannah, what's her name? The one who Hannah, Nicole Hannah Jones, or Hannah Nicole Jones, 1619 Project, right? One of her parents is actually white, so she is biracial in that sense. We have a lot. I had no idea until I wrote this book that 10% of all African Americans in the United States are immigrants. And if you include second generation, it goes up to 21%. So that's a very large chunk, of the African American population. We have, in 1970, we had small groups of Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese, and almost nobody else. Now we have millions of people from India. We have a lot of Koreans, a lot of Vietnamese, a lot of Cambodians, a lot of other groups. The Hispanic population, which used to be almost, 80-something% Mexican. So when you talk about Hispanics, in practice, you could get pretty close to the truth by just using Mexicans and Hispanics interchangeably, but now they're only 60% of the Hispanic population and shrinking. And, even just in Florida, you have Puerto Ricans who fled after the last hurricane in Central Florida. You have Cuban Americans in South Florida. You have a large population of Mexican farm workers in Central Florida. You have wealthy Venezuelans, Argentines, and so forth who have fled their socialist governments and bought property in South Florida. And you have illegals from those countries who are much poorer, who don't want to go back to like Venezuela, those two groups don't get along with each other because it's like the elite of society. One irony is that back in South America, you could be one of the white elite white elite, in my experience, South America are very racist. I lived in Peru for a while, looked down upon the mixed race people who work for them. But you come to the United States and suddenly you're a member of a minority group. Which is kind of anyway, no one was anticipating that in 1977 when they made these statistics, but we haven't really changed them in any significant way since then. We haven't rethought them. We haven't said, the black-white binary doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't make sense to retain these really inexact classifications.
Wow. Yeah, okay, there's a lot to unpack there. So back to where I began. So somebody like Elizabeth Warren says, I have Cherokee ancestry. If she wasn't famous and running for president and a politician that the right loves to hate, probably this would have just flown under the radar. Like, okay, whatever, you think you're part Native American, fine. But, now since she's prominent, she's Pocahontas and people make fun of that idea. But as a rule, the way you've just described it, most people, if they're just applying for a job or whatever, no one's going to check. They're not going to run a 23andMe test on them. If they say, I'm 1/16 black or 1/8 black or whatever, octagon and what's the what is
Octoroon,
it? Octoroon and
quadroon,
yeah, quadroon, right? So and so we just sort of take people's word for it, and then you had an interesting discussion about to what extent the groups themselves that represent them. Let's say you claim to be Native American. There are Native American groups that would say that person's not really part of our group. They don't come to our meetings. They don't identify with our food and clothes and culture and so on. They're faking. Or they would say, yes, they are because they're part of our group and we see them and they're part of it. That seems pretty subjective.
Well, so these Directive 15 classifications, for American Indian, it actually says that you have something like cultural identification with the group. So that's very vague. And, one other aspect of these classifications was when they were made, there was still, we've become a more tolerant society over time. There was still enough social disadvantage to claiming one of these ancestries that people thought that you wouldn't do it unless you really were a member of that group. Like no one really thought that you're going to claim to be African American. Even today, I think that's pretty rare. I think it's much less rare to exaggerate your American Indian heritage and so forth. But in any event, for the most part, no one's checking. But there are, when I wrote the book, I had seen law review articles saying that there's only like one case ever when anyone's ever challenged anyone's race. So race is completely self-identified. But I actually discovered there are several dozen. It usually comes up, I shouldn't say almost always, but it usually comes up when someone applies for a minority business enterprise preference and their name is, say Mark Smith or whatever, and they say they're Hispanic and they have blonde hair and blue eyes and they go to shake hands, with whoever's in charge. It's like, wait a second, your name is Mark Smith. You look more like you look like a Mark Smith. You don't look like a Juan Lopez or whatever. What makes you Hispanic? And he'll say, well, my great grandfather was a Mexican immigrant. And they don't really ever go back and look at the genealogy chart. So, okay, well, is that enough? And some federal agencies and state agencies and courts have said, well, it just says in the official rule that you have to be of Spanish origin or culture. You are of Spanish origin, Spanish language origin from Mexico. That's enough. And others have said, well, this wasn't really meant for such people. It was really meant for people who face discrimination based on race. And if your name is Mark Smith, no one knows you're Hispanic. You don't look Hispanic. You don't speak Spanish. You're not active in the Hispanic community. We've decided you're not Hispanic. So there's that interesting dynamic. But I think Mark Smith, in my hypothetical, is right. If he legitimately thinks of himself as at least part Hispanic, he's not defrauding anybody by putting that down. It's maybe a flaw in how the rule is written. It says Spanish origin. He has Spanish origin. If they want to say you're of Spanish origin and have brown skin and a Spanish name such that people might discriminate against you, that would be a different rule.
Yeah, interesting. I was watching that documentary series on Tiger Woods, or just a film, I guess it was, on ESPN. And, he described himself as Cablinasian, back to that. But I think his point was, I don't want to be the best black golfer ever. I want to be the best golfer ever, period. Right? But the black community felt like, come on, Tiger, you're one of us. We need you on our team. You're the most prominent guy we know in the field, in your field, that's black, or at least close enough. Right. And they even had an interview with Oprah where she, or they had a quote from Oprah where she was commenting on when he first came out with the Cablinasian thing. And she was not terribly happy about it. Like, come on, you're one of us, right?
But it's very interesting. I mean, I'm not a member of the Black community, so I'm not an expert on, the sensitivities and culture there. However, Tiger Woods was only, I feel it was 1/8 or 1/4 of African descent. And his mother, he is more Thai than anything, if I'm remembering correctly, 50%.
Yeah.
So yeah, he does kind of, so we have this one drop tradition in the US is if you look like you have any African ancestry, we call you Black. But that was a racist tradition, right? That somehow you're contaminated by any African blood you might have. And therefore, even if you're only 1/32nd or whatever, you'll never be accepted as white. But why do we necessarily want to accept that in 2022? If someone feels like, I'm not telling anyone ever how they should identify themselves, but if someone says, well, look, I'm 1/4 African, but my mother is Thai, and I also have Native American heritage, I want to respect all of those in my identity, why should other people come and say, well, no, we want to go back to the one drop rule from Mississippi in 1900?
Yeah. Neil deGrasse Tyson makes a funny point in his new book, Starry Messenger, about he has a chapter on race, and he's talking about Barack Obama, the first Black president of the United States. Well, if he was the first president of an all-Black African country, he'd be the first white president that the country ever had, right?
Well, I saw something
context
interesting.
Matters.
Yeah, no, I saw an interesting comment that someone wrote on some blog somewhere that Barack Obama could have made a big contribution to race relations in the United States by, instead of saying I'm the first Black president, saying I'm the first biracial president. But I think that his political career, as we know, was largely based on getting the support of the Black community in Chicago by identifying with that community, going to Jeremiah Wright's church and using that as his base of support. So he couldn't really do that. And, but I also think that things have changed. And since things are changing so rapidly in our attitudes. I always like to tell people how, when I was a teenager, there used to be this show on TV called Love Connection. Remember Love Connection by chance? Right? So they would take somebody and they match them up with like 3 dates, and then there'd be a vote on whether the audience liked the date and who they should go out with, and they report on their date, and they'd have another vote. But anyway, what I noticed even as a kid, it's like, why are the Black people only match with Black people and the white people only match? I was like, do they ask them first, or do they just automatically assume that we should only have? And the answer, I think, in retrospect, I never asked. I never looked into it. I have to assume the answer is that they just automatically match them. And the reason is, I didn't know this at the time, that it wasn't until 1992 that for the first time, when they asked Americans, do you approve of interracial marriage, that it got a majority. So it would have been very controversial to have had to have mixed the couples. In 1958, it was 4%, which is crazy. And now it's like 95%. I mean, that may be the biggest, the largest level social transformation on any issue ever in American history. I mean, even slavery didn't become as unpopular. Didn't go from like 4% to 95% in like a 40-year period, right? So that's an amazing social transformation. I think the idea of being biracial or multiracial, there were activists in the 90s and that sort of died down, but I think that idea is much more accepted and prevalent now because we have so much more mixing now. It's so much more accepted to be in interracial relationships.
Yeah, even just reading your book, my sense was that this whole classification system is totally outdated. It's ridiculous. Really, it's just absurd. Yet we still have it. But can you see a time, maybe, I don't know, half a century from now, 2100, a century from now, when everybody's like Tiger Woods, right? We're all Cablinasian or whatever we are. Just, so mixed up that there's just no language that can possibly capture any kind of collective group identity.
Yeah, I think that American society is moving in that direction. And one of my big concerns about the classification system that we have is that it's actually operating at cross purposes to developing a real multiracial, multi-ethnic American identity. And it's not so crazy. I mean, again, we're sort of like fish in the water with a lot of this stuff. We don't realize what's going on around us because we're so used to it. But besides the acceptance of interracial couples, just the fact that we consider like all of what we say are white people white, instead of like breaking them down into their constituent groups and thinking that really it's only Northern European white Protestants who are the real Americans. That's a relatively recent phenomenon. I invite anyone who's curious about this to go to an odd place to do sociological research, but it's the Coca-Cola Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. I was there 2 decades ago, and it still sticks in my mind that they have one room or whatever where they have all the old ads by decade, basically. And until the 1960s, the Coca-Cola ads could just have easily have come from Nazi propaganda. I mean, literally, everyone is, rosy-cheeked and has light eyes or light hair or both. And clearly the idea was that the all-American person who drinks Coca-Cola is Northern European, fair-skinned, fair-eyed, probably, if not fair-haired, fair otherwise, and that these, swarthy Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans, the Italians and the Jews and the Greeks, they're not, the real Americans. And of course, we've completely lost that today. We're completely also lost the old, there was a famous book by Will Herberg in the 1950s, Protestant Catholic Jew, that we're going to have, that basically American society has basically trifurcated, and now ethnic identity is fading away, but religious identity will be the key to the future, at least outside of African Americans. And at the time, of course, it was extremely controversial that John F. Kennedy was running for president. Could a Catholic get elected? And the answer is, in some ways, actually a Catholic couldn't get elected because millions of Protestants who normally voted Democrat voted for Nixon instead because they didn't want to vote for a Catholic. And the only reason Kennedy won was because a lot of Catholics who voted for Eisenhower voted for Kennedy because he was the identity politics candidate for the Catholics, right? And if you had told people in 1960 that in 2022 we'll have a Catholic president, Jewish Senate Majority Leader, Catholic Speaker of the House, Black/Indian Vice President, and a supermajority of Supreme Court justices who are Catholic or Jewish, and it's been that way for a while now, they would have thought, and it wouldn't be controversial. Like, there wouldn't be any, they would have thought you were crazy. That would have been, impossible to conceive of. So I think a lot of people on the left who are interested in critical race theory and identity politics, they're stuck in the mindset. They're stuck in, the equivalent of the 1960 religious mindset, that this is the divisions we have, this is the way the divisions will always be, and the only thing we could do is to divide people by these groups and make sure each group is getting its share. Whereas I think one could be much more optimistic about it, given the trends in society and given other progress that we've made. Say, why can't we just imagine 50 years from now that we just think of an American as, someone of any race, any appearance, any combination of Asian, European, African, and so forth, and we'll just have this overall American identity. And frankly, I think if you study politics and human nature at all, people are much more likely to get along with each other and have social solidarity if they think, oh, we're all Americans. And if you say, I have to mention this. I actually at some point came across this phrase, white racial consciousness, in the course of writing the book. And I said to myself, this is like a David Duke kind of thing, right? White racial. So I started looking into it because it seemed to be coming up in some odd places. And actually, if you Google white racial consciousness or you look it up in the academic literature, this is something that the left in academia is promoting. Their theory is that we need to make whites more conscious of their whiteness and really think of themselves not as I'm gay or I'm Catholic or I love bowling or I'm a Mets fan, but I'm a white person. That should be their primary identity. Why? Because that way they'll realize their white privilege, feel guilty about it, and want to help people of color. And I just find this the most loony, out of touch, contrary to human nature and history idea I can imagine. The idea that you're going to tell people, okay, we want you to have a very strong white, ethnic, racial kind of identity, and then use that to not help the white group, but help other people. That's not how even in the short term, there are some people, we all know that human nature is such that if you tell people to associate with a group, that they want that group to succeed at the expense of other groups. And that was my initial instinct. There must be some social science research on this as well. And it turns out, not surprisingly, the more people identify as white, the more racist they are likely to be. I mean, this is not a surprise to me, but why people could think otherwise is just boggles my mind.
Yeah, you got that great line in your book about the history of encouraging white people to think of themselves as white is not good. Right. So how do we get to a post-racial society or a racial neutral society? Here's what I wrote about my own so-called race. On an evolutionary time scale, we are all Africans. Since my maternal grandmother was German and my maternal grandfather was Greek, and my fraternal grandparents were from Sweden and Denmark, since confirmed by 23andMe, and since I'm a member of the species Homo sapiens that originated in Africa, I'm either an other, or if such an amalgam could ever be allowed on such forms, I'm an African, Greek, German, Swedish, Dane, American, and proud of it.
Well, as far as the federal government is concerned, you're just white. So all those subtleties, all those subtleties go away. But, you know, my big idea, let's say, from the book, besides learning about how all these classifications came to be and how they're defined and how they're enforced, is that, as far as I'm concerned, the way to go is to at least have a strong presumption of separation of church and state. You know, we have, race and state. Like, why do we have separation of church and state? You know, whatever you may have learned in third grade civics class, the reason we have separation of church and state is the founding fathers looked at Europe and said, oh my God, they have recently had a 30 years war where Catholics and Protestants of different sects were mastering each other, killing off a pretty large percentage of the population of Europe, trying to get power for all the different religious groups. Religion is something that is very visceral to people, very important to people, and they want to impose it on other people. And the only way to avoid such horrors is to have the state be officially neutral between the religions, let people be as religious or not as they want, organize as they want, but don't give them official power or recognize the different religious denominations officially. And that's worked pretty well, right? Even at times when America's been very religious, we haven't had, other than, you know, we've had occasional riots against Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses, you know, obscure sects, but in general, we've managed to keep the level of religious conflict to a real minimum because there's no power in it. That's what really, power causes violence. The pursuit of power causes violence. Similarly, if we could get to a point where we could start eliminating these boxes and not have any official use of race, it's hard to get fully to that point as long as we feel the need to have civil rights laws. It's going to be really hard to enforce them. It's really hard to enforce the Voting Rights Act if you don't know who's voting. So it's a problem. But if we can at least have a strong presumption that we want to get rid of these boxes, we want to get the government neutral, we could get to a point where, just like no one really cares whether President Biden is Catholic or Protestant or anything else, no one really cares. You know, Governor DeSantis, as recently as 40 years ago, it would have been a big deal that he might be the first Italian-American president. No one cares anymore,
right?
Because the government doesn't track it. There's no power in it. So all the what Nathan Glazer, the sociologist, called the unmeltable ethnics in the 1960s have essentially melted. So this is the future that I would envision. Not that, and that again, it doesn't mean that people can't be strong Catholics in their hearts and minds and their actions. It can't be that someone. We're not stopping anyone from wearing a "Kiss Me, I'm Italian" shirt and marching on Columbus Day and whatever else proud Italian Americans do, but the government has no say in it. So similarly, this is what we want with race. We're not telling people we're going to forbid you from having an African American identity or a Mongolian identity or whatever it may be. We're just saying there's not going to be any grift in it. There's nothing you're going to get out of it, and nothing's going to be taken away from you in it. So if you want to have an ethnic club at college, or you want to join, the Knights of Columbus or whatever, that's cool with us. We don't care. But you're not going to be able to go to the government and say, "Give me stuff because my ancestors spoke Spanish."
Interesting. Yes. To finish my previous point, when Richard Dawkins founded his foundation after The God Delusion came out, became a bestseller, he issued he had some swag. One of his swags was a T-shirt that said, "We're all African." And then, people would ask, and, you promote the theory of evolution. Oh, yeah, not creationism, evolution. We're all from Africa. So anyway, I was cleaning out my closet last year, and I found that shirt. I thought, oh, I'm going to wear this shirt. And I thought, maybe I better not wear that shirt now. We're all African. A white guy walking around with a shirt that says, "I identify as African," essentially. I could get in trouble for that, right? Because that's become a thing now.
Yeah, this whole idea that we'd be somehow appropriating African identity, this whole notion of cultural appropriation or appropriating food or whatever. I mean, that's again an attempt to draw artificial lines between different peoples and cultures that have never actually existed in the world. There's always been interconnection and trade. And as you know, because you've written about this, that's why we're not all living in poverty. The fact that we've been able to interact with each other and borrow things and learn things from each other, and just trying to shut this off into separate categories. Well, you can't wear that shirt, or you can't sing that song or whatever because it's appropriating it from somewhere else, I just think is really nonsense.
I mean, all of culture is appropriation. That's the whole point of culture.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's some point about, well, when there are people who don't have legal rights and you steal stuff from them and don't compensate that. But okay, I we're all against that. But once we get past that, the idea that some university has like South Asian Food Day and they serve Indian food, but they have no Indian chef working in the Sodexo kitchen, so this is somehow evil because only Indian people could cook Indian food. I mean, that's just really that's reactionary as far as I'm concerned. That's going back to our tribal history where these are our tribal rituals and how dare the neighboring tribe because they will anger the gods or whatever. I don't know.
You mentioned financial incentives for some of these racial categories. So talk a little bit about like minority-owned businesses. What if I was a minority-owned business, what advantages could I get from the government or the state or whatever? And how do they, if I'm married to somebody who's minority and the two of us own the company, is that a minority-owned business? How does that work?
It's really hard to figure out exactly what the government's doing in this regard, in part because the Supreme Court basically said 30 years ago that it's presumptively unconstitutional, but they're doing it anyway. So they don't really want to advertise exactly what's going on. But I think the primary thing that goes on, if you get certified as a minority-owned business. So in college admissions, as we said already, if you're African-American, you get the highest preference. If you're Hispanic, you get a preference, but not as much. If you're white, you don't get any preference. And Asians, if anything, get discriminated against. And Native Americans really depends on whether the school really cares. If you're in Arizona, they may care, but in New York, they may not really. In any event, for minority business enterprises, it's anyone who is a member of one of any of the designated minority groups can qualify to be a minority business enterprise owner, as long as you have less than a certain number of assets, because you're also supposed to be somehow disadvantaged. You're presumptively disadvantaged if you're a minority. This is how in fact, there's no such thing in theory as minority business enterprises for the most part. In theory, it's disadvantaged business enterprise, but the law says that you're presumptively disadvantaged if you're a minority, and the only way to overcome that presumption is if your income is too high, or your assets. So what do you get? You generally get a bidding preference, which means, like, let's say there's 3 bids in the highway contract, 2 are from white-owned companies, come in at, say, 1.7 million and 1.65 million, and you bid and you come in at 1.72 million. You're close enough that you might get the contract anyway because you're a minority-owned business enterprise. And again, it doesn't matter what minority group you're from. So the education context is kind of a more interesting one. Are there benefits to diversity?
But hang on one second, yeah. David. So who gets the benefit? Not just the minority-owned business, but who gets the credit for that? The county or the city or the state that's granting
the minority-owned business? This county, city, state, federal government will basically be paying more for the contract. In other words, instead of accepting the low bid, they accept a bid that's close enough, but from a minority.
And what's their incentive to do it? Because then they show to the bureaucrats we're fulfilling our affirmative action criteria or something like that.
Right. Well, for one thing, the federal government, if you have any federally funded contracts, requires you to do this.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. But most states and cities have their own rules. And one way the federal government's gone around the Supreme Court saying you can't do this is they've passed it along to the states. So you certify who's a member of a minority group. And the states then hire companies that will do a study showing that there's historic discrimination and current discrimination against minority groups, which is the criteria the Supreme Court allowed as the wiggle room, and it's all become corrupt. And the studies are predetermined to find the result they're looking for. Now, if you're married to someone, if you're white, but you're married to someone who's, say, from India, you put the business also in her name, even if she has no part in it, because then she's the co-owner and you're now at least 50%. I think the rule is supposed to be at least 50% minority owned. So you are now at least 50% minority owned business. But one of the crazy things about this is that, at least in the context of education, they're considering in theory diversity, And they're at least modulating the level of preference you get for, are some groups really worse off and we're trying to help them. With the minority business enterprises, you get the exact same preference. You could be an immigrant who came here from China or Mexico or wherever 5 years ago. You got your citizenship after 5 years. You apply for government, you're well educated, have a lot of money, but not enough that you don't meet the threshold, and you start a business with the military or the Department of Transportation, and you're immediately getting a preference. I have never, in all the research I did for this book and all my entire life as a law professor, blogger, I've never seen anyone justify why a recent immigrant to the United States from, say, India, where there are a lot of people, a lot of Indians own businesses, they're one of the wealthier ethnic groups in the United States. Why an immigrant from India who's been here 5 or 6 years should get a preference over, say, anybody really who's born in the United States and so forth? There isn't any good reason. The only reason is that in the 70s, when these programs started, they were really intended primarily for African Americans. The other groups were very small, and no one expected it. I tried to get data. It's really orthogonal to my book, but I became so interested in this issue. I tried to get data. Well, what percentage of these contracts are actually even going to African Americans now? Because African Americans, you have to have some capital to start a business. The whole problem is they have less capital, whereas a lot of people who come from here, from Bangalore, and work in Silicon Valley and have a PhD and get some investors, you have some money available. So I had some friends in the Trump administration who said they tried to get the data for me. They said it's there, but someone would have to gather it. And the answer came back, no one will reveal this data. It would be so embarrassing who actually gets these. So I don't know what the answer is. From the limited data I could gather, I'd be very surprised if even 20% of the contracts for minority business enterprises are going to African Americans. One indication of this is that in 1990, there was a mini scandal in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. at the time was like about 60% African American. They had minority business enterprise preferences. Unlike the federal government, which doesn't count Portuguese as Hispanic, they counted Portuguese as Hispanic. There were 3 brothers who owned a series of interlocking companies. They were getting, between those companies, 90% of all minority business enterprise contracts in Washington, D.C.
Wow. Right. So somebody's coming around and checking those bids. Let's say you're the mayor of Los Angeles. Somebody's going to come around and go, okay, you guys funded that bridge, the 6th Street Bridge that was just redone in L.A. Let me see the bids you got and who got the bid and what was your criteria. Somebody's checking that.
That's a good question. I think this is done on sort of not, as you probably know, the construction government contract industry has not been known for being a good government hallmark, right? And it's always been a lot of sort of under the table dealing and connections. And it's really remarkably hard to know exactly how they decide what who's getting the low bid and what preference you need. Some counties and states still have women business preferences, so that adds an additional complications. Some have veteran preferences. I mean, which means to say that in some places the preferences are somewhat meaningless, because if you add veterans and women and all the different minority groups that there are in the United States, official minority groups that there are, you're talking already 85-90% of the population. And then if you add in exaggeration and fraud, which there's plenty of in claiming these statuses as well, I'm not clear if there's anybody who's not getting the preference. So it really does also depend on whether women-owned companies are getting the preference, because once you add them in, then everybody just puts their wife's name on the company, like you suggested, and they're getting the preference too.
Yeah, just in reading your book, I was discouraged about my lifelong kind of ambition of, helping to achieve a race-neutral society in which, the color, how much melanin you have in your skin is the least interesting thing about you. Why should I care about that? Here's what I wrote in my little essay on this. Just in the context of critical race theory, asking about what percentage of black professors are there in STEM fields. That's a big one, because it's low, and so then I asked, okay, what percentage of STEM professors have brown eyes or blue eyes or hazel eyes or green eyes? Pace Jane Elliott's famous blue-eye, brown-eye experiment. How many brunettes, blondes, and redheaded professors are there in STEM? Who knows? Who cares? Why are these superficial characteristics considered meaningless, except perhaps in Hollywood and on dating sites? Whereas equally frivolous features like skin color, hair color, and form, and racial traits are proxies for everything from intelligence and personality to moral worth and social value. The answer is obvious. Race and racism have manifested in slavery, segregation, lynchings, Jim Crow, profiling, police brutality, etc. That's our original sin, whereas we have no history of prejudice and bigotry based on eye or hair color, with the possible exception of blonde and ginger jokes. So, but you know, after reading your book, I thought, I don't see how we can get there, because the system is set up to incentivize everybody to focus on ticking those boxes and filling out those forms that tell us focus on race and skin color and other features.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some arbitrariness to this. Again, like the fact that we include Hispanics as a minority group, regardless of their skin color, really is kind of arbitrary. And then for Asians, putting, you know, Indians were almost classified as white until an Indian American group got wind of the fact that they were going to be classified as white and lobbied at the last minute to have it changed to be Asians. But, you know, if you look, it's interesting because if you look at statistics, it turns out that, you know, the gap between different racial groups, first of all, we already mentioned there's gaps within the different groups as well, but the gaps between groups is often less than the gap between other characteristics that we don't worry about discrimination based on. So if you want to be successful, you'd much rather be a 6'2" well-proportioned individual than being 5'2" man and heavy set, right? We know there's tremendous appearance discrimination, and that tall men do much better economically than short men, and thin men do better than fat men. And for women, of course, similarly, they have their own appearance-based issues, and no one really cares about that. And I think for the reason you said is that you can't point to the history of it and so on. But it's not that. But it does bear mentioning that we're not really looking for equity along all grounds. We're taking some things that have particular historical resonance and say we want to worry about that, but we don't worry about the fact that, like, Greek Americans have much higher than average incomes, and you know, Irish Americans maybe a little bit below average, because we just don't. There was never the official level of discrimination there. But you know, but it can get a little ridiculous. The one that I always mention is Justice Sotomayor in a case called BAM, after University of Michigan was banned from using affirmative action by referendum after they won their case in the Supreme Court. A group sued saying the referendum itself was unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court upheld the referendum. And Justice Sotomayor wrote this very impassioned dissent about how race matters in the United States. And she went on and on about race mattering. And the two groups that she talked about race mattering for were Hispanics and Blacks. And what I noticed at the time, I think I mentioned in the book, is that, first of all, Hispanics are not officially a race under government statistics, and not in any objective sense, of even to the extent you believe in race. They're a mixed race group. And she never mentioned Asians, which have more of the sort of thing we think of as racial characteristics, at least East Asians do, than Hispanics do. But this is because she was filtering the view of race over, well, race means that you look different from white people, from your Caucasian people, and you're below average on the socioeconomic level. But that's a very politicized view of that. If you look at, I'm not saying that the history doesn't matter to the United States, but if you look at different countries, different cultures, when they have minority groups and majority groups, it's not always the case that the majority group with the political power has better socioeconomic indicators, right? Jews in Eastern Europe, Chinese and immigrants in various countries, Lebanese immigrants to Africa were all minorities, all faced official prejudice from the powers that be, but all had more economic success than the main group in the country. So one can't just say that the only groups that one needs to, or that the only groups that really face discrimination are successful groups, and the only reason that groups are not as successful is that they face discrimination. There are so many complicating factors, and I think Sotomayor's opinion is an example of, well, Hispanics are doing worse than Asians, so they must be more of a racial minority than Asians, even though they have less, racial classic characteristics. And look less different than the average from European Americans and Asians do. And that's just like, once you start racializing people based on, well, we look at the statistics and this group is doing less well, then you're not talking about race at all. You're just adopting some theory that somehow, despite the fact that different groups have a random different set of characteristics culturally and otherwise, that somehow you expect them to come out exactly the same.
Yeah, then you end up in these tautological definitions like Ibram X. Kendi does. What is racism? Well, whenever two groups differ in any characteristic that I think is important, that's racism. Well, why do they differ? Because of racism. And then, well, okay, so we need an exogenous cause. It's, poverty, or it's lack of reading, or it's broken homes, or whatever.
Right. I mean, you could take, a really good example of this, you could take two different African immigrant groups, Somalis and Nigerian. And Somalis actually they have a lot of different ethnic groups in Somalia, but they are overall more related to Arabs than they are to Black Africans. But they are Black, they're from Africa, and they do worse on the various social economic indicators than Kenyan or Nigerian American immigrants do. And you could come up with all sorts of explanations for that. Well, they were more educated to begin with, blah, blah, blah. The point is that race is not the sole determinant, clearly, of what goes on in society. And in some ways, the hardest thing to tackle, I mean, we've made a lot of progress on racism, but the idea, we can't solve anything until we tackle all racism. That's an extremely difficult thing to do. But to say, let's figure out what things other than race lead to success and encourage those, that in some ways may be a more promising and easier to fix endeavor.
Yeah, but again, this constant obsession about race, I just see, we're again the first week of November, we're having this conversation. The World Series just started, and somebody pointed out, he was Dusty Baker. There's not a single player who was American-born Black. I guess there's Black immigrants, or there's Cubans or Puerto Rican players. I don't know what, South American, but not American-born. It's like, who keeps track of that kind of stuff? Why is that important? Who cares? I just want to watch them play baseball.
Right. Well, and I think there's 2 points he made there. First, I mean, this wasn't true 50 years ago, but now I don't think there's any team that isn't just looking for the best players, because no one cares whether the players are Black. The Red Sox 50 years ago may have wanted to keep a majority white team because they thought they had a racist fan base, but no one cares now. And this is a pretty efficient market. If there's no Black players, it's because for those teams, they weren't, able to, that's not who they recruited to be the players for their team. And they weren't, of course, you roll dice across a national map. They're not all going to fall on the same team. There are other Black players out there, but no one, in other words, they're not having no Black American players because they were trying to keep them out. That's number one. Right. But number two, the logic of that would be, well, there are lots of Black American players on these NFL teams. In fact, it's like 60, 70%. So does that mean there's too many? Well, why would that be? Why? These are apparently the best players. Why would we expect a random distribution in every particular sport? I mean, I'm even talking about across society now, right? And or the thing is, the NHL said, we have to make a lot more progress to having more women in the in NHL front offices. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are women hockey fans out there, and assumably it's the fans who are more likely to go work for NHL teams. But I've never really met any. I mean, maybe one or two in my life. Almost every hockey fan I've ever met is a guy, and then therefore you kind of expect that people who'd be really interested in going into the hockey business wouldn't be 50-50, right? So it's just kind of strange.
Selection bias, kind of pre-selection bias. Right. It's like the pipeline problem in STEM fields. Why aren't there more Black and women mathematicians and physicists? And, the knee jerk was, well, they're just racist and misogynist. It's like, but if you actually meet these professors and the people that work in these universities, these are the most liberal, tolerant people you'll ever meet. They're not racist. They're not, you may find some old guy, who's making comments about women or something, but, the vast majority are young, liberal, tolerant people looking to hire women and people of color in their departments. But there aren't as many applying for the jobs. Why? Because the pipeline problem, they're not going into those fields back in middle school or whatever. Well, why aren't they doing that? Well, then you got to go back to preschool, grammar school, and then preschool. And before you know it, you're talking about home life again, and poverty in inner city neighborhoods that are, crappy environments and so on for that. And so maybe that's systemic, racism of some kind or another, but not in the more general sense. And you can actually identify it. Well, here's the specific problem. Like a social science equation. Here's the 12 causal vectors that are leading to this pipeline outcome, 20 years later.
Right. Well, if your book Conspiracy behind you, I'll put so you're plugging my book, Classified. I'll plug your book Conspiracy.
Yeah,
when you get into the weeds on when you get into the weeds on this, then there's this issue. Well, if they're so racist, how come 8 people from what we call Asian Americans are wildly overrepresented? And then you really get into the weeds, and you start to get into something, otherwise enlightened, well-educated PhD types will start to get into wacky conspiratorial thinking where they'll say things like, well, white people let the Asians succeed. They could then say, see, we're not racist, but that gives them the excuse to keep down black people and Hispanics. It's like, well, where are these people meeting? I always say whenever there's like a Jewish conspiracy theory, I was like, why am I never invited to these meetings where the Jews decide who gets what?
Why are you one of the learned elders?
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Well, David, we're coming up on an hour and a half here, but I don't want to let you go without asking you about reparations. That's another one of these hot button topics that's on the table for discussion. I had Shelby Steele on the show, and this is just the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. How would it ever be determined who gets what amount of money for reparations? Well, after reading your book, I can see bureaucrats could easily do the calculations, right? So here's the equation, right? So you have that ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves. That's a category, right? They should get more money than just general people of color.
You could, although, there are a lot of obvious justice considerations that would be a problem. There were some black people who owned slaves. There are black people who were better off than other black people because their father was the white plantation owner who gave them a better job and then freed them earlier. And therefore they had, so do you then have to subdivide by what job you had, how much white ancestry? It would be really difficult. The way we've gone around a lot of these classification problems in practice is we just let people self-identify. The problem is once enough money comes into play, I think, if people think there's enough injustice involved, lots of people, what about people who are basically white identified because their black ancestors passed as white at some point, quote unquote. I think it's all nonsense, but, in American sociological terms, passed as white. So it's a real issue. But, I think that ultimately that, it's a distraction because the amount of energy and so forth spent on that could be better spent on just various measures that could be taken to help people today. I also think, by the way, this is contrary to my own cultural, religious upbringing and environment, which is, Jews, we don't forget, like, slight thing. We still talk about, remember Amalek, the tribe that attacked the Jews in the desert 3,000 years ago. And it's just like, 3,000 years, we don't forget what you guys did to us, right? But in fact, and this is partly a reflection of my Jewish ancestry, I've realized, it's really not worth it to think about what happened to your ancestors or what terrible things were done to them, and just to let it go and make the world a lot more peaceful. But also, I have a memoir written by my grandmother who suffered horrible experiences during World War I. She was a refugee. She suffered, people were shot around her. She was subject to, anti-Semitic abuse by her neighbors. She was kicked out of her town by the Russian government because they threw. I didn't even know this until recently. All the Jews who lived in the border towns were expelled by the Russians because they were afraid they would sympathize with the Germans because the Russian government, ironically, because the Russian government was so mean to the Jews. Anyway, I think to myself, this is all really terrible. I love my grandmother. It's all really terrible what happened to her. But, if all those things hadn't happened to her, I wouldn't be around. Any one little change in her life, and that sperm doesn't meet that egg and I'm not around. So why should I take it personally? It didn't hurt me. It hurt her. I feel bad for her. But if it didn't happen to her, I wouldn't be here. So I'm just going to let it go. Right? And I think if a lot of people and people always argue, well, that's not true. It is true. It's logically impeccable. If anything had happened before you were born, if it didn't happen, you wouldn't exist. So just stop worrying about what happened to your ancestors, whatever grievances you have, and worry about your own life.
Yeah, I like that attitude a lot. It seems to me, again, after reading your book, that if you set up a program like that where there's financial incentive to be so identified and the government starts cutting checks, which it's quite capable of doing, as we saw during COVID, then people would line up. Well, what about the Native Americans? Certainly they have a claim to having their land stolen. What would be the value of New York City now? Well, no, I guess maybe that's not the good example. Well, maybe it is a good example. Or any of, Louisiana Purchase. You know, it was Napoleon sold it to Jefferson. It wasn't his to sell, right?
Well,
What would be the value of that land?
I have to say there are some live issues there about treaties that were given to the Indians that were then violated, where there's still some real claims there. But no, I mean, I think that this is a problem with relying on. There are problems like, look, I know you're sympathetic. Not everyone is listening will be sympathetic to this, but anytime you rely on the government to solve any major social problem, you wind up, okay, we have an idea in our head of how this will work. Here's how we're going to create justice through government. But the government doesn't just like say, oh, that's a good idea, let's implement it. It gets siphoned through, the whole lobbying process, the rent-seeking process, the political horse trading process, and it comes out the other end as something completely different, first of all, than what was originally anticipated, number one. And number two, that's never the end of it. One thing that happens is that other groups say, we want to get in on the bandwagon too, like you said. So every group that faced various kinds of discrimination will want in. But then the other problem is then the other side says, well, how come we didn't get anything? I don't care what happened to your ancestors. I'm growing up in Appalachia under poverty. And then they say, well, let's start our white identity politics group to lobby for stuff for us. Because whenever you say, well, they can't do that. They weren't the one. That's not how politics works. Politics doesn't work from, oh, well, here's here's QED, the logical line from here to there. And that's what people vote and get organized based on emotion, based on culture, based on what they think they individually deserve without any reference to any, objective moral standard. So once you start giving out stuff based on race, for whatever reason, it's going to lead to other people, on the one hand, other people wanting to get stuff, and then people who don't get stuff resenting it and maybe counter-organizing. And then maybe 100 years from now, we'll have people saying, well, we should have never given those reparations. We should have never had affirmative action for African Americans. No, we want affirmative action for us. Now we want reparations for that. And it could be a never-ending war of all against all. So the best thing, to do is to have a dynamic market economy with sound educational system, promote the kinds of values that lead to socioeconomic success and start from there. But it's not because one necessarily denies there's some justice in some claim. It's just because the way that people want to address these claims goes through politics, and politics tends to be a terrible way of addressing anything.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Well, when Dr. King gave his famous speech in '63 about his dream of being judged by the content of our characters and not the color of our skin, when I was in college in the '70s, that seemed like a plausible dream. Like maybe when I'm in my 60s, we'll be there. Well, I'm 68 now, and it looks like the pendulum's moving in the other direction, at least for a while, of emphasizing race more than character. I hope I'm wrong. I hope this is just a blip. What do you think?
I think this, we're at you never want to say this is the fulcrum where things are changing, but we're at a very interesting point in our society now, because like I said, every measure of tolerance, intergroup relations, interracial dating, interracial marriage. I tell people, when I was a kid, I would occasionally see a black-white couple. It was almost always a black guy and a white woman, almost never the reverse. But now I see the reverse all the time. I think that was sort of almost the last taboo of interracial dating. And now it's just like so commonplace, one wouldn't even, if I hadn't just written a book on the subject, I wouldn't even be thinking about it, right? So we have a lot of intermixing and this real opportunity to create an American common identity just based on Americanness or living in the same country, whatever you want to call it, as opposed to balkanized racial or ethnic categories. But there are political incentives to not only keep the status quo with regard to classifications, but to emphasize them more and more. The Biden administration wants to turn Hispanic from an ethnicity to a race. They want to make Arab American or Middle Eastern North African to another race, and to further do it. And that is acting at cross purposes. So which will win out? Will the spontaneous evolution of culture towards a more tolerant multiracial identity win out, and will politics win out? You never count out politics because there's the force of the state
right
behind it. But we're making more progress given the underlying politics than you might expect. So maybe there's some good news there.
All right. Okay, everybody, go out and get this book, Classified. Order it on Amazon, or better still, go to audible.com, my favorite site for that, and listen to it while you're driving or whatever you're doing. All right, David, thanks so much for the conversation. What's your next project? What are you working on now?
I don't know. This was exhausting. So
yeah, that
we'll
was
see.
a huge, a lot of bureaucracy to cut through to track down all that. It's great. All right. Thanks again. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks, Michael. Good to talk to you. Bye.